We are at an incredibly exciting time in education. We are, in effect, writing a new story, creating a new picture. And part of this new picture is bringing together what each of the different traditions, each of the different educational philosophies have said in the past. And what has happened is that in the last few years, we've begun to see that what we've learned about education is transcending itself, that one of the things that education does best is it goes beyond itself. We're coming to understand that we have moved past individual philosophies and we need to bring them together and integrate them. Consequently, we're pulling the principles out of the best of our previous understanding and putting them together in a new package, which is what we're calling integrative education. The integration and interdisciplinary work bringing together the different strands of education into a new picture so that this new story says something more exciting than what we've said in the past. In effect, we're saying we've just begun to scratch our understanding of human potential and human capacity, and it's really now time to be able to dive into that in a way that produces the kind of results that we're capable of as an educational system and as a culture.
Sometimes as we shape new systems and discard some elements of the old and integrate some elements of the new, we end up with a kind of a mess, a little bit of a stew.
Exactly. What's happening is that it's kind of like a bus trip. We've traveled a long way on the bus line. We've come to the end of the bus line and we're looking at the possibility of 4 different transfers. And everybody looks at them and say, well, is it, transfer line A, line B, line C, and line D? And everybody wants to go in both directions at once. And so you get that kind of a stew or a mess where there's a transition period where there's a great deal of confusion. The other side of that is you have a period of time where people are afraid to get off the old bus. So they hang on to the old bus saying, I'm not getting off of this one because it's worked and it's gotten me this far, even though they know it's the end of the line and it's not going to take them any further. The challenge, and this is where really a school like John F. Kennedy University's graduate program, the master's program is involved, is saying, okay, we're willing to take your hand and get off of this bus, and let's together check out these new buses and see how we can move on the next piece of the line, and what needs to be brought together out of these 4 lines, A, B, C, and D, that can be useful in making that next part of the journey. And it is a challenge, and it clearly is frightening for people. I know that the teachers that I talk to feel afraid because they think that the school administrations don't want to support that new journey. They themselves were trained in a system which took them to the end of the line, and so they don't know how to get quite there. They're not sure how it would apply in a practical sense, and so it leaves them in a position where they feel hesitant and frightened and uncertain about whether they're going to move forward in this direction.
In California and in the Bay Area in particular, are we more fortunate or less fortunate in terms of the global picture with this new look at education?
I think a little of each, in the sense that California has a remarkably talented group of people who are teachers. They're bright, they're well educated, and they are exposed to a group of researchers in this area who are probably among the best in the country. You have some outstanding research being done on learning, some pursuit of different models of learning. And the difficulty is that what you have are 2 skilled groups. And when you're generally pretty good, you have a hard time letting in or taking in new information because you think what you're doing is working pretty well. So what you have is a situation where some people who like what they're doing pretty well have a hard time letting in new things, even though those new things might improve their performance. I think the key thing is a shift in understanding on the part of the teachers that education has got to involve ourself, the human instrument, to look at ourselves in effect as an instrument of learning, so that we are learning to play us much the way that we would learn to play a piano, to learn what the higher notes would be, what the lower notes would be, what kinds of chords we make. There's a sense that it's not just about getting skills, it's about getting understanding the way we learn in different states of consciousness, understanding the specific skills, understanding the new perspectives that we have to have about ourselves as human beings to really maximize our ability to break through that surface level of understanding that we've had. And this is the major challenge that new teachers and new researchers are pursuing in this area. How do you get through what we've done before to try and open up new doors of experimentation?
Are there other countries in the world where the education process is working more smoothly in terms of integrated education than the United States?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I can give you a really good international answer. I know that one of the concerns that has come up in a number of the Soviet Union countries, the Eastern countries, behind the Soviet bloc, has been a concern with something that has begun to emerge here, which is a focus on how we learn, not just what we learn. That it's become incredibly important to discover what are the conditions that facilitate learning, rather than just getting the facts. Because if we're going to really be effective, people need to understand the dynamics of what makes learning happen, rather than just getting concrete pieces of information, which eventually wear out in terms of their utility. We know that our knowledge base multiplies or doubles every 5 years, so that what we learned 5 years ago is pretty much either outmoded or been replaced by new information. And so the concentration on how we learn, I know particularly has been of issue in some of the, in Bulgaria and Albania, as they've tried to pay attention to certain of the research that's being done there by George Lozanoff on what they've called superlearning and Suggestopedia. So that has been one of the places. I'm not sure if anybody else is in much better shape. We have here in this country some incredibly good work being done on what we need to do and what we need to pay attention to. We just have not been able to integrate what our science has told us about the nature of learning into our classrooms. You might say we're 20 to 25 years behind, and there's no appreciable expectation that they're going to make a big jump into that, into integrating that material right now. And in fact, you might say that that situation is pretty much consistent across all of our sciences. What we know about physics, chemistry, biology is not currently taught in our school systems. What's happened is there's a lag time between what we know about the outer edges of science and then what is actually shared with our students. And that's one of our challenges too, to catch up with what we know and to bring it home to people so that it becomes part of our cultural understanding and the models we work with.
We want to talk a lot about the interpersonal relationships that go on and the emotions involved in learning and in teaching. But before we do that, let's go back to the physical plant and let's talk about some of the things that we know from the research that has been conducted that are perhaps in place and perhaps not in place in terms of setting the environment physically. And maybe we ought to start with the classroom. What kind of a physical structure should that be, or should there be a classroom in education?
Well, what you're really speaking to is what might the future school look like? What might it evolve toward? And this is really based upon our understanding of how it is that people learn. What would be suggested is that people learn best when they have a maximum amount of novelty and maximum amount of stimulation. We want to stimulate the curiosity of a child or an adult to be paying attention. The more attention you're paying, the more chance you have to do the fundamental thing which is involved in learning, which is pattern recognition. When you're teaching people to recognize patterns, that's when the brain is working best. And so consequently, many of the researchers suggest that what we need to do is up the level of stimuli in the classroom, make it a continuous multimedia event where children, rather than sitting quietly in their chairs, are in fact involved in a multimedia, almost a circus of sorts, where things are hitting them from many, many directions. That some of the researchers are suggesting we up the amount of stimuli tenfold, so that what we really have is a tremendous level of activity happening. Now, I think this might be counterbalanced on the other side by an understanding that probably in the future a great deal of our learning is going to occur at the hands of our relationship with a computer, which is probably what will happen is the private time will be interactive work that the child does with the computer, maximizing learning that is no longer best taught by teachers doing it in a rote form, but instead is being done in relationship to an objective teacher that doesn't give the emotional message that the teachers give about you're not doing well and the judgments and the fear of failure. I mean, what we know is that the single greatest inhibitor to learning is fear of failure. Fear inhibits learning more than anything else. With the computer, you're on a self-based mastery process where the computer is not making you fearful, you're just getting feedback. And so there's some capacity to balance, on the one hand, what might be called the multimedia circus and excitement of the classroom, with, on the other hand, some opportunity for real private, individual, one-to-one work with you inside, paying attention to a self-mastery program that the computer works out with you. I think the other way of recognizing the connection in this is that not everybody learns the same way. It's clear that there are different styles of learning. We know that there are not only different styles of learning, but there are different styles of thinking. And when we prescribe one classroom for all of these different styles of learning and different styles of thinking, what we have done is set up a situation which is bound to not be effective. A simple example might illustrate. We know that in Los Angeles, they've done a study recently which looks at delinquent children. And those delinquent children are seen to be kinesthetic learners rather than visual learners. And what we have is a situation where our schools are set up to do visual learning. Well, it's like a situation if I said to you, we're going to have a test. We're going to test you how well you can put food into your mouth using your right hand, and you're all right-handed. But then you're the left-handed learner, and so everybody gets the same test, and you're doing it left-handed, and the other students are doing it right-handed, and you feel yourself failing consistently. Well, the situation in the school is set up not to work for you because you're left-handed and the other students are right-handed. Analogously, if you're a kinesthetic learner, somebody who learns through your body and through movement, by getting things in the body by your sensing of them, rather than by getting them visually, you're at a disadvantage. And if you continue to get negative messages that you're not good, you're not a good boy, you're not a good girl, your self-esteem gets damaged, and you may be further involved in the cycle that gets caught up into non-effective behavior, self-esteem issues, and consequently the possibility of delinquency. So we know that we need to set up classrooms that support different styles of learning. We know we need to set up classrooms that increase the amount of stimuli that a student is getting. We know we need to set up classrooms that allow for individual private space to work one-on-one with teaching computers. We probably can guess that the two major breakthroughs in education in the next years are going to be with computers and in the interactive process a student does with that, and with the process of going inside, studying your own consciousness. Maybe the two great jumps will be in that area.
In the traditional classroom, you have the teacher's desk at the front of the room.
Right.
You have a chalkboard, two large chalkboards, generally covering the entire front wall.
Mm-hmm.
You have the alphabet in large letters
That's
and
right.
lowercase letters around the side walls.
Uh-huh.
And you have all the students' desks that you can enter from one side and you can't get out the other side. So once you're in, and they all face the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
There's a heater on the left side of the room and a row of windows.
That's right.
Okay, that's it. That's my experience with a whole lot of school architects apparently for years and years.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the physical plan again. We'll talk about the interaction and methods of learning. But what do you do? Do you have a different classroom for? Today I feel like going to the multimedia circus, or I want the quiet of the computer classroom, or I need the traditional classroom because I need to keep focused. Or how do you approach that, given the realities of this modern world, that there are X number of dollars for education, and in most instances the physical plants have already been built and designed?
Mm-hmm. I think the redesign process is going to focus on two things, on small learning areas, small learning centers, which allow groups of students who work in similar ways and are working at certain speeds to be working in that group together. In effect, I think what you're going to see is a decentralization of the classroom, less of everybody in one large group and more of the small units working together, focusing on that which they're ready to deal with. And I think it's going to be partly based around the computers, which will have perhaps group interactive processes working on a particular question. And partly it's going to be based upon just which learning styles are proceeding best to answer a particular question. So you may have people who are visual learners pursuing individual study programs through computers that are very different from what the kinesthetic learners might get. Because I think what's going to happen in the next decade to 20 years is we're going to be building computer programs that are going to be tied to the learning style and the thinking style of the student, rather than everybody trying to learn it the same way, so that the same knowledge will be passed, but it will be absorbed through the mechanism that works most efficiently for you. In effect, I'm suggesting that we're moving to, in the future schools, is an educational efficiency based upon the style of the student rather than the functional management issues of the classroom.
In some traditional classrooms, you had the robins and the bluebirds and the skunks or whatever, and there was some group instruction, but there were some smaller units. Those were primarily based on who were the fast readers and the not so fast readers and the slowest readers, or the brightest people in math, and generally those groups all overlap, so that you had the classroom divided into 3 or 4 groups based on the teacher's perception of who the smartest children were and who the dumbest children were, to put in real blunt terms.
Mm-hmm.
What about that? What about the nature of competition in education?
Mm-hmm.
Must it be eliminated?
Well, I think we've got a mistake that's happening there. I think what we have it set up is so that some people experience themselves as not being okay. And since we know that our beliefs about ourselves are the greatest limits to our own achievement. The question is, how do we not create a situation where students perceive themselves as less than all right, as below the line? And I think the answer has to do with a mastery not based upon the class's rate, but upon your own rate. And I think there's no reason that every child can't get 100%. It's just a question of what speed they learn it at. And I think the issue is that when you have greater fear involved that you're not doing as well, it decreases the learning speed. So that what we have is a situation where it becomes self-fulfilling. The more you think that you're not okay, the less well you do. The more frightened you are, the less well you do, and the further behind you fall. I think the situations that we're going to be looking at are going to suggest that what happens is every child can get 100% at their own speed, and that every child can perceive themselves as learning fully rather than creating a notion of passing at 70%. Why should that be considered an acceptable way to learn material? I think the notion is that every child can get all of the material, given that we set up the learning conditions so that they can get it that way. That doesn't mean every child, if we're doing a physical activity, can hit a home run, because they may not have all the hand-eye coordination or the muscle strength. But when it comes to cognitive material, there certainly isn't any limit to everybody making 100%, given that they've had the conditions set up to support them mastering it step by step.
What about the situation where in dealing with human interaction, with the students themselves, and I don't know exactly where this is learned, but I know that it seems to be passed on from generation to generation, where some children in a classroom are considered by all the other children to be the brains, and some of the other children are considered to be the dummies.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes those determinations are made somewhat independent of what the teacher is doing in the organization. They set up their own class structure and hierarchy. Is that a negative force in education? And can it ever be eliminated?
Well, obviously people have their perceptions and judgments independent of what the teacher is saying. And I think that some of that has to do with a social hierarchy. Some of it has to do with social isolation. But my sense is that it's possible to be able to turn toward looking at learning in a different way, which is rather than just concentrating on whether somebody is brainy, I think the question is trying to train multiple senses. We have seen in the last decade, the research has shown us that we have not fully been able to make use of our visual senses, our auditory senses, and our kinesthetic senses, and that different people have different strengths. So, for example, let's take the student, the classic student who is the bright brain. The classic picture that I had when I was growing up in New York City was there was this guy with these very thick glasses who at that point had a crew cut, who didn't move very well in his body, that didn't go out to play PE, but that seemed to know something about astronomy or science, and somehow got hundreds on all the math tests and did well on the science, but couldn't function kinesthetically. Well, what we've done is establish those people as a certain primacy in classroom, because the classroom supports that kind of learning. I think the message that needs to be passed to the schools is that there are multiple skills that can be shown to be highlighted or underlined so that students can get their self-esteem according to the different strength they have. It's not meant to undermine the strength of somebody who has great cognitive skills like that brain, but it's meant to take the student who knows through their body and is a great athlete and perhaps has a great feeling for sensory process, to let that be elevated and to be known to be a tremendous skill too, so that everybody gets recognized for their strength. It's not that everybody is weak, it's that everybody has a different pattern of strength distribution in terms of their skills. And unfortunately, our school system tends to be oriented around the visual. And given that we support people who master learning visually faster, those other students are not recognized. And what we just need to do is wake up to the negative consequences of that kind of situation. I was working with a little boy who's 7, and Eric was somebody who was the top athlete in his class, but he couldn't get his math down. And his mother, night after night, would be sitting there saying to him, "You can't get your math down, you're obviously stupid." And he went from being this very robust, excited little boy into this little boy who you could feel contracting further and further and further. And you could see his image being that he wasn't going to pass. And yet here was what, in effect, the great leader, the boy who would take everybody up the tree and who would lead them all in all these different places, but he was beginning to think of himself as not all right. And I know that given the belief systems having so much to do with our capacity, we have to look at what message we pass to people about what they can believe about themselves. And this fundamentally ties to our belief that only one kind of learning is important. And so it is incumbent upon teachers to know about different styles of learning, to support different styles of learning, and to not themselves be caught in believing that what they did best is also what the students need to do best.
Let's talk briefly about testing and grading. You've suggested that passing at 70% is really not a very good situation. You want 100%. From my experience, and I'll just throw it off the wall, the easy graders, and there are some teachers that are perceived that way, that want to be, it seems they want everyone to love them, so they didn't set particularly high standards, really didn't do any more of a service than the unreasonably low graders who always had to have a percentage of the class that failed at anything that they assigned to, I guess, to show that they were the brightest people in the atmosphere. How do we approach that in integrative education?
I think the issue is facilitating high performance and making that the understanding. I think our grading system is a system that's set up to fail people. And the question is, how can we enhance people? It's not the negative reinforcement we want. We know that people learn best under positive reinforcement. So how do we set up a positive reinforcement system? It's not that we shouldn't have standards. It's obviously the standard should be there, but the standard should be based upon how to show somebody how to maximize the possibility for somebody achieving a high performance. So what does that? Well, first thing we need to do is look at how it is we habitually misperform. In other words, we all learn habit patterns that get in the way of our performance. Simply said, I was working with my daughter last night on mathematics. She was learning the math table. She's in 3rd grade, and she's working with multiplication. And we got to certain numbers, and I could see her shoulders tighten up, and I could see her face get that blank look, and I could see her whole breathing get heavier, and she right away was not in the condition to be able to memorize what it was she was doing.
So what did you do to resolve this learning problem, the block?
Well, the first thing I did was I asked my daughter to notice what it was she was doing. So what we did was we exaggerated it because we wanted to make it funny. In other words, when you can poke fun at that what you're doing out of fear, you can begin to lighten up. And so she began lightening up. And first I had her had her face scowl a little bit, and then I had her pull her shoulders to touch her ear, and then I had her breathe real fast. And by that time she was laughing at it. And then we went back to studying it. She just took a breath and made it slower, and she relaxed her face, and we laughed a little more. And then we concentrated on the material, and we went through it. And afterwards what happened is she got it, and when we went back to it to practice it again, it was easy because what she'd done is she'd lightened up around it. So nothing inhibits learning more clearly than being frightened. And people are concentrating. I mean, when learning occurs, when people are worried about the end result rather than the process along the way, they don't learn as much. So if they're concerned about the grade rather than how they're learning, everything works backwards. The more you're concerned with what is called end gaining, the result at the end, and less on how it happens, the less clearly you're able to get the cues along the way that give you the result at the end. So I think the mistake that we've gotten so focused on grades and so focused on outcomes as a way of measuring whether we did it or not, that we've forgotten the point, which is we were concentrating on how we got there, not what we got at the end. So the whole mistake is that for teachers and students, the game should be concentrate on the middle, and the end will produce itself. It'll produce itself differently, maybe at different speeds, but the grading process works against most people's development.
In the couple of minutes that we have remaining, could you give us an exercise in learning of some sort we might practice, those people listening to the radio right now?
Well, I think the most important thing to realize is that for everything we think, there is a way in which we react in our body. Our thoughts are not different from our body. From every state of mind, there's a state of body. And what happens is instead we have cut ourselves off. And the question in the schools is how do we find our wholeness, our connection between our mind and body? So the game really is to experiment. And how do we begin experimenting? Well, the answer, of course, is simply, because you don't go to complex experiments right away. So let's just play with a simple experiment and discover what we can. If I'm going to ask you to, and I'll ask the audience that's listening to do this as well, if you just say the word yes and notice what happens. Let's try it together. Yes.
Yes.
yes, yes, and just notice what happens in your body. Just take note of it. Now say the word no. Repeat it again. No. Repeat it again. No. And then notice what happens there. Now, Charlie, what can you tell me about what you noticed difference between when you said yes and when you said no?
When you say yes, there's an opening. It feels like the air passages almost are opening. And when you say no, there's definitely a closing. It's a finality.
So what you began to notice is that there's a difference between a thought which somehow opens your body or seems to open you up to the outside versus closing you down. Now, taking a very simple thought like that, you take a complex thought and add 2 or 3 levels of complexity and think what begins to change in your body. I mean, as soon as you begin to think particular things, certain changes occur in the body. Now, we know from psychoimmunology, which is the study of the relationship between mind and body in relationship to the area of healing, that everything you think changes what happens inside you. So it becomes incredibly important, if you're going to discover what kind of state you're in, to know what kind of thoughts you're thinking. And a student in school needs to really pay attention to what they're thinking, because it's changing everything in their whole state, not just their mind, including their particular beliefs. So what we do, let me give you an example about psychoimmunology. What we know simply is that I'll give you an example from cancer, since that's always the most, the most powerful ones. If you have been told you have cancer and you have a very calm and apathetic response to it, what happens is your immunological system does not respond as aggressively to fight it off. While if you have a more angry, aggressive response to it, no, I won't take it, then what happens is your immunological system gets activated and goes into strong fight to beat back this cancer. What I'm saying is that when you are a student and you are learning, everything you think about yourself, everything you think about the world, all the way in which you act with your mind produces bodily changes which impact your ability to absorb and take in knowing. We think that the human body is just sitting there while our mind is taking stuff in. On the contrary, if you're in a place where you're saying no energetically, you can have all of the best teaching in the world going on and nothing is getting through you. While if on the other hand you've got an environment and a condition that's saying yes, everything begins to work and you begin to take in. Now, other people have different experiences. Some people, for them, no gives them the space to take things in because they've set a boundary. Other people, yes, they feel boundless and frightened. And so what you face is the differences of styles and inner organization that allows different kinds of learning possibilities to occur.
Is it a good idea to repeat the word yes if you want to be in a positive in your mind, if you want to learn the lesson?
The game is to find out how it works for you. The important thing is to play with your human instrument, your own body and mind, to be able to discover what opens doors to learning and what closes them. And what we've done with the integrative education program at Kennedy is to concentrate on those things which set the conditions, both psychologically, physically, emotionally, to be able to maximize learning, so that what we get is the best return on the time we spend.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.